The desert does not forgive. It does not negotiate. It does not pause while men catch their breath or redraw their plans. It simply continues burning, indifferent, absolute, and it lets the heat do what bullets sometimes cannot. At 14:37 local time, the temperature at grid reference Kilo 7 Foxtrot had already cracked 47 degrees Celsius. The air above the sand shimmered in long horizontal waves, bending light until the horizon looked like it was breathing. In that kind of heat, a man's shadow felt like an insult, a reminder that the sun occupied every angle and left no corner of mercy. SEAL Team 6's reconnaissance element call sign Wraith Delta had been on the ground for 11 hours. Their mission was textbook. Insert quietly, move to an overwatch position 4 kilometers northeast of a compound believed to house a high-value target, confirm presence, photograph logistics, and exfil before dusk. No contact. No footprint. Ghost work. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Calloway, 34, had run 17 similar operations across 3 combat deployments. He'd been in Yemen. He'd been in Mali. He'd been in places that didn't have names on official maps. He knew what a clean operation felt like, and this one had felt clean from the jump. The ground was right. The angles were right. The intel was fresh. He should have trusted the feeling at the back of his neck that said otherwise. The first sign was the drone, not one of theirs. It appeared from the southwest, low and fast, running a frequency that chewed through their encrypted comms in under 4 seconds. Not jamming something subtler, a bleed signal, the kind that doesn't kill communication but degrades it just enough that the man on the other end sounds like he's drowning. Petty Officer First Class Derek Saunders, their communications specialist, caught it first. He was 26, sharp, methodical, the kind of man who read technical manuals, the way other men read novels. He pulled his headset and looked at Calloway with an expression that said, "This is wrong and I don't know how wrong yet." Calloway gave the signal to compress their position. They never got the chance. The RPG came from the northeast, the direction they'd been watching. Someone had known exactly where they were looking. The rocket-propelled grenade hit the ridge of the wadi they'd been using as a natural blind, and the concussive force alone threw Calloway 3 meters and cracked 2 of his ribs against a sandstone shelf. Then the second one hit the helicopter. The Pavehawk had been holding a low orbit 6 kilometers out, waiting for exfil coordinates. The pilot chief warrant officer Grant Ellison had been banking east when the shoulder-fired missile caught the tail rotor. He didn't go down in a straight line. The aircraft rolled twice in the air, shedding pieces, and came apart against the desert floor in a long skid that left burning aviation fuel in a 50-meter scar across the sand. 3 men survived the impact: Calloway, Saunders, and Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Holt. Ellison and the crew chief did not. Calloway pulled himself upright through the pain of broken ribs and found his rifle by instinct. His left arm wasn't working properly. Later he would learn the shoulder was partially dislocated, but the rifle went up and his eye went to the optic and his mind went cold and professional, the way it always did when there was nothing left to do but fight. Holt had a fragment wound across his right thigh, deep enough to bleed freely but not deep enough to have cut the femoral. He'd used his own tourniquet. He was pale and moving slow, but he was moving. Saunders had a burned arm from the first explosion. The radio equipment on his back had caught part of the heat and his comm suite was compromised. He was already trying to patch together a secondary signal from components, his fingers working with a precision that injury hadn't taken from him. The enemy was organized. That was the first thing Calloway understood when he got his eyes on the terrain. These were not opportunists. They had positioned before the ambush at least 2 sniper elements on elevated ground, a fire team approaching from the east, and the drone circling overhead to deny any satellite or airborne support window. The whole choreography of it said, "We knew you were coming, we set the stage, and now we are going to finish this." They had numbers. They had high ground. They had the drone. They had time. Wraith Delta had 3 men, 1 functioning rifle, a handgun, a tourniquet already on 1 leg, a radio that might or might not be sending, and approximately 40 minutes before the approaching fire team closed the distance to a range where a single grenade would end the argument. Saunders got a partial signal out at 14:51. It lasted 9 seconds before the drone bleed cut it again. 9 seconds. Calloway pressed his back against the wreckage of the helicopter's forward section and looked at his 2 men and did not say what he was thinking, which was, 9 seconds might not be enough, but it was all they had, so it would have to be. He checked his ammunition, pulled what was left from Holt's rig, looked at the approaching dust cloud to the east and did the math. 40 minutes, If they were lucky, probably 30. He told his men to find shade and drink nothing, because there was nothing to drink. The sun continued to burn. The operations center at the forward base received the 9-second burst at 14:53. The signal was broken, badly compressed, riding the edge of intelligibility, but Signals Sergeant Patricia Oberg had been listening to fractured radio traffic for 8 years, and she recognized the cadence of a distress call the way a musician recognizes a key change. She flagged it immediately, ran the decode, and had it on the main screen in under 90 seconds. Wraith Delta, 3 survivors. Grid reference Kilo 7 Foxtrot, hostile encirclement, exfil requested. The room that responded to this information was not large. Tactical operations centers rarely are. It held 8 people. The duty watch officer, 2 intelligence analysts, a communications relay team, a logistics coordinator, and 2 senior officers who had been in the middle of a briefing on something else entirely when the alert came through. Lieutenant Colonel Franklin Marsh was the senior American officer present. He was 51, thick through the chest, with a career that read like a highlights reel of the last 2 decades of American special operations. He had a calm that people sometimes mistook for detachment. It wasn't detachment. It was the practiced discipline of a man who had learned that panic in a TOC kills people just as surely as bullets in the field. He looked at the grid reference. He looked at the terrain overlay. He looked at the timestamp and did the math on how long 3 men had been on the ground. QRF status, he said. The logistics coordinator's answer was not good. The quick reaction force was 38 minutes out by air, and the hostile drone package over Kilo 7 Foxtrot would almost certainly bring down a conventional exfil helicopter before it reached the landing zone. Ground QRF was over 2 hours. Air support was complicated by the same electronic countermeasure drone that had already compromised Wraith Delta's communications. Marsh looked at the terrain again. There was one ridge, one approach that offered concealment from ground elements, and a potential blind spot in the drone's coverage pattern, a narrow thermal shadow created by the topography itself, invisible to infrared from above. Someone who understood that shadow and moved slowly enough could reach a position overlooking Kilo 7 Foxtrot. The distance from the nearest viable insertion point to that position was 3.2 kilometers. In 47-degree heat, across open desert. What assets do we have that can reach that ridge before Wraith Delta's window? Marsh asked. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone knows the answer and no one wants to say it first. Captain James Whitfield, the British liaison officer, was the one who said it. We have Mirage 1. She's already forward staged. She could be moving in under 8 minutes. The second silence was different from the first. It carried a specific texture, not uncertainty about the tactical option, but uncertainty about what the room was allowed to say about the person being proposed. Major Douglas Kepler, the second American senior officer, broke it. 1 operator, no spotter, no drone overwatch of her own. He wasn't asking questions. He was listing objections in the form of questions, which is a different thing entirely. Correct, Whitfield said. In that heat, at that range, she's done longer and worse, Whitfield said quietly. Kepler shook his head. He looked at Marsh. Sir, this is not a realistic option. We're talking about a single shooter, no support package, in open desert, against a coordinated element with their own counter-sniper capability. The probability of success. I'm not asking for a probability, Marsh said. Kepler went quiet. Then his jaw tightened, and he said something that Whitfield would remember for the rest of his career. He said, with respect, sir, 1 woman? She won't last a minute out there. The room did not react. Reaction would have required someone to be surprised, and no one was surprised, because that particular form of doubt was not new. It had been expressed before, in different rooms, about the same operator, in different words that always meant the same thing. Marsh looked at the terrain overlay for a long moment. Then he looked at Whitfield. Get her on the line. Her name was not Mirage 1. That was the call sign she'd been given during the Desert Warfare course 3 years earlier, when her instructors had needed a way to explain what they were watching without sounding like they were writing fiction. She moved through desert terrain the way heat moves through air, not visibly, not with announcement, but in a way that you felt before you could explain it. Her actual name was Sergeant Claire Donovan. She was 31 years old. She had grown up in Hereford, which was either a coincidence or a prophecy depending on how much you believed in that sort of thing, and she had joined the British Army at 19 because the alternative, a business administration degree she didn't want, seemed like a longer and less honest form of suffering. She had been selected for SAS support roles at 24. She had been certified as a sniper at 26. By 28, she had quietly accumulated a field record that her handlers kept out of written reports because written reports had a way of attracting attention, and attention had a way of attracting politics, and politics had a way of ending careers that should have continued. She was not tall. She was not physically intimidating in the way that the word special forces typically conjures. She had light brown hair she kept pulled back when working, gray eyes that people consistently described as watchful in the way that implied they had looked into them and felt observed in return, and a habit of silence in groups that read as coldness until you understood it as concentration. She was sitting in the shade of a vehicle when Whitfield's call came through. She had been cleaning the action of her rifle, a process she performed at intervals regardless of whether it needed cleaning. The way some people check their phone not for information but for the sensation of having something to do with their hands. She listened to the brief. She asked 2 questions: wind data at altitude over Kilo 7 Foxtrot, and whether the hostile drone was autonomous or remotely piloted. Whitfield didn't have an answer to the second question. Assume autonomous, she said. Behavior pattern will be predictable. I can work with predictable. She was moving in 6 minutes. The desert she walked into was not the desert of photographs. Photographs flatten it, drain it of weight, make it look like an abstraction. The reality was a physical presence heat that came not just from above but from the ground itself, radiating upward through boot soles, pressing against every exposed surface of skin. The air had a taste, mineral, dry, faintly metallic, like the inside of an old coin. She moved low, below the sight lines of anything at ground level, which meant below the subtle rise of the terrain features she'd memorized from the map. She moved slowly enough to generate no dust signature visible from the air, which in practice meant something between a walk and a controlled crawl through stretches of open ground, her body flattening, her rifle cradled across her forearms, her face angled away from the direction of the drone's last known coverage arc. The sand was the temperature of a skillet that had been sitting over a low flame. It did not burn immediately. It accumulated. 10 minutes of it was discomfort. 20 was pain. At 30, her forearms were raw and her knees felt like the joints had been replaced with hot gravel. She did not stop. 3.2 kilometers is not a large number on a map. On the ground, in that heat, with the need for concealment and the absolute requirement not to disturb the surface patterns that an overhead drone's cameras could read, 3.2 kilometers was an enormous number. It was the kind of distance that breaks concentration not dramatically but gradually, the way a tide comes in, until suddenly you realize you've stopped calculating and started just enduring. She didn't let herself get there. She counted. Not steps that was too granular, too grinding. She counted decision points. Each choice of path, each terrain feature she reached and passed. Each moment she had to pause and read the drone's pattern before moving again. Decision points gave her a structure. Structure prevented endurance from collapsing into mere survival. At 1.8 kilometers, she found the thermal shadow Whitfield had described. It was real, and it was narrow, perhaps 40 meters wide at its broadest, the result of 2 ridge features intersecting in a way that created a wedge of ground that the drone's sensors couldn't heat map reliably. She moved through it quickly, using the relative cover to get upright and close the remaining distance to the ridge at something approaching a walking pace. At 2.9 kilometers, she heard the first exchange of gunfire from Kilo 7 Foxtrot. Still distant, still intermittent, which meant Wraith Delta was still fighting, which meant she still had time. She reached the ridge at 15:22. She had covered 3.2 kilometers in 31 minutes in 47-degree heat with a rifle, ammunition, and a minimal water supply. She would not describe this later. She would not be asked to. She found her position, a natural depression in the ridge face, shallow enough to be invisible from below, angled perfectly onto the floor of the area where Wraith Delta had gone to ground. She settled into it the way water settles into a shape completely, with no wasted space, every part of her body making contact with the ground in a way that reduced her profile and distributed the heat of the surface evenly enough to be bearable. She extended the bipod. She found her eye behind the scope. Below and ahead, 3.2 kilometers away, she could see the situation. The first thing she cataloged was not the enemy. It was the air. At 3.2 kilometers, the atmosphere between the rifle and the target is not empty. It is a medium one with density, turbulence, thermal gradients that refract the bullet's path in ways that accumulate and compound. In a temperate climate, at this distance, even with perfect technique and perfect equipment, the variables are significant. In a desert at 47 degrees, with heat rising from the ground in waves that distorted the image through her scope like looking through imperfect glass. The variables were extraordinary. She read them methodically. Wind. The surface wind was running roughly 6 kilometers per hour from the southwest, at altitude, which mattered. Because a bullet travels through multiple air layers at this range, the pattern was different. She watched the behavior of dust on the far ridgeline. She watched the thermal plumes rising from the helicopter wreckage. She constructed a picture of what the air column looked like across that 3.2 kilometers, not as a number but as a shape, thermal drift. The heat rising from the desert floor would push the bullet upward in the first half of its flight, and then, as it slowed and began to drop, the same thermals would have a different effect on its trajectory. She had to account for this, not as a single correction but as a curve, an adjustment that changed across the distance. Bullet drop. At this range, a bullet drops significantly from its line of departure. She knew the ballistic tables for her ammunition cold. She also knew that tables were approximations. And approximations at 3.2 kilometers could mean the difference between center mass and a clean miss. She had one round. One first shot from a cold barrel, a barrel that had not been fired recently, whose metal was not yet at the temperature that affects internal ballistics in predictable ways. Cold bore shots behave slightly differently from warm bore shots. Every serious sniper knows this. Every serious sniper has a cold bore 0, a documented correction for the first shot from a cold weapon. She knew hers. She'd verified it 2 days ago against a measured target under similar temperature conditions. She trusted it, but trust at this distance is not comfort. It is a calculated decision to proceed on the best available information. She looked at the target. The enemy commander was not hiding. He was moving between positions with the confidence of a man who believed the engagement was won, issuing orders, directing his fire teams, crouching occasionally but not staying down. He was wearing a chest rig and a chamois, and he was holding a radio handset. And when he gestured, people moved. Calloway's position was 40 meters to the commander's 3 o'clock. The fire team approaching from the east was now close enough that she could count them. 7 men, moving in a loose formation, perhaps 90 seconds from closing the last open ground between them and Wraith Delta's defensive perimeter. She did not have 90 seconds worth of planning left to do. She had done all the planning she could. What remained was execution. She settled her breathing. Not the slow meditative kind that was for static targets and ample time. This was controlled respiration. 4 counts in, hold 2, out 4, hold 1. It brought her heart rate down and steadied the minor tremor that even the most disciplined hands produce at this level of muscle fatigue and environmental stress. She placed the reticle. She made her final corrections. Elevation dial 3 clicks up from her established 0, wind hold adjusted left. Thermal compensation built into the point of aim rather than dialed in, because at this range, dialing and then correcting cost seconds she didn't have. She took one more breath. Let half of it out. The trigger broke. The sound of the shot in a desert is peculiar. The crack of the muzzle is absorbed quickly by the open space, leaving an echo that sounds less like thunder than like a single, sharp knock on a door. She was already tracking through the scope, watching, waiting the 3.8 seconds it takes a bullet to travel 3.2 kilometers. The commander dropped, not the falling of a man who has been startled or who has stumbled. The clean, total collapse of a body whose central nervous system has been interrupted without warning. There was no dramatic backward stagger. There was simply a man, and then the absence of a man. In the same instant, the battlefield below went silent for exactly 2 seconds. She was already finding her second target. 2 seconds is a long time in a gunfight. In those 2 seconds, the hostile fire team to the east stopped moving. The 2 sniper elements on elevated ground stopped firing. The drone held its position. Every person with a weapon on that desert floor experienced, simultaneously, the particular paralysis that comes from having their framing of the situation suddenly invalidated. They had believed they were winning. They had believed the engagement was controlled, the outcome certain. And then the man who had orchestrated that certainty had simply ceased to exist, at a range that no one could account for, from a direction that the terrain made theoretically impossible to use. In those 2 seconds, Raymond Calloway heard the silence and understood something had changed. He did not know what. He was running on blood loss and adrenaline and the stripped-down cognition of a man who has been fighting for his life and knows he is losing. But the silence registered. Something had happened that wasn't part of the enemy's plan. He said, quietly, to Holt and Saunders, "Something's out there." Then the shooting started again, not from the enemy, but from Mirage 1. She worked through her priorities in the order she'd established before taking the first shot. Radio operators first, because without communications, the remaining hostile elements became uncoordinated and reactive rather than directed and proactive. Then the elevated sniper positions, because they posed the most acute threat to Calloway's team. Then the fire team to the east, working from the front of the formation backward, the lead men first, who would otherwise maintain momentum toward the SEAL position. Her second shot took the primary radio operator. Her third hit the antenna housing of the secondary radio unit, which she had assessed would be used when the primary went down and which, now disabled, left the remaining hostile element dependent on line-of-sight signals and verbal coordination that the distance between their positions would make unreliable. Her fourth shot found the eastern sniper position. Her fifth, a correction of 1 click left from the fourth, accounting for the drift she'd now empirically confirmed rather than predicted, found the western position. 5 shots in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Below, the hostile fire team to the east had stopped. 2 of their number were down. The remaining 5 were in cover, trying to locate the shooter, looking in the wrong direction toward the southern ridgeline, which was where sound geometry and instinct both pointed, but which was, in fact, the opposite of where she was. Calloway heard the change in the quality of the fire. He heard the pauses, the hesitation, the fact that the incoming rounds had stopped and had been replaced by the sounds of people arguing with their own uncertainty. He got his rifle up and began engaging the fire team to the east at a range of 200 meters, a distance that even in his current condition was manageable, and he was surprised by how easy the first shot felt, like the resistance had gone out of the air. Holt was up beside him, pale as chalk, one leg not working properly, but his rifle was moving and his eyes were sharp. Saunders had the handgun and was watching the northern approach. 3 minutes later, the hostile force had broken contact, not retreated, broken, in the disorganized way that happens when leadership is gone and communications are gone and the firing is coming from an angle that cannot be located or suppressed. They were still alive. For the first time since the helicopter went down, Raymond Calloway allowed himself to believe that they might stay that way. She had known the drone would recalibrate. An autonomous surveillance drone operating in support of a ground element follows a behavioral pattern set at deployment: primary coverage arc, secondary coverage sweep, anomaly detection protocol. When the primary element goes dark, when the radio signals it monitors suddenly stop, it doesn't simply hold its position. It begins to search. The search pattern was predictable, but predictable is not the same as avoidable. Predictable means you can anticipate the next move. It does not mean you can escape it without cost. She had already moved by the time the drone completed its first recalibration sweep. 100 meters northeast, using the thermal shadow as long as it lasted, then going flat and still as the drone's coverage arc swung across her last position. She watched the drone through the scope, reversed to maximum objective lens, and tracked its behavior. It was not looking for heat signatures, the ambient temperature made that unreliable. It was looking for movement against the static background of the desert surface. She did not move. For 8 minutes, she did not move. The sand pressed against her forearms and her cheek and her chest like a hot iron held an inch from the skin. The burn was continuous and specific, and she filed it into the category of information she was tracking rather than pain she was experiencing, because the distinction between those two categories was the difference between a sniper and a casualty. The drone's arc moved east. She moved north, 30 meters, and found new ground. The problem was that the hostile element, reduced and disorganized but not eliminated, had recognized that the fire was coming from altitude and had begun systematic suppression of the northern ridge with what remained of their heavy weapons. They didn't know where she was. They knew roughly where she wasn't, which was anywhere their survivors could currently see. And so they were trying to reduce the set of places she could be by volume of fire. It was a reasonable tactic. Given their remaining resources, it was the best available option. A round hit the ridge face 6 meters to her left, sending a spray of sand and pulverized rock across her position. She felt the impact through the ground before she heard it. She did not move. Another round, 12 meters right. They were walking fire across the ridge in a pattern. She could predict the next impact point. It was going to be very close. She moved fast and low, rolling left, using the momentum to carry her into a new depression she'd identified before the suppression began. It was 30 centimeters deep and 3 meters long, and it smelled of ancient mineral and heat, and when she pressed herself into it, she was below the level at which the pattern of fire could reach her without direct adjustment. She'd lost her angle on Kilo 7 Foxtrot. She needed to move again to regain it. Moving meant exposure to the drone. She checked her ammunition. 3 rounds remaining. Below, she could hear the gunfire intensifying in the direction of Wraith Delta's position. The hostile fire team to the east had reorganized. Without their commander and without coordinated communications, they were operating on initiative, which in this case meant continuing to close on the last known SEAL position, because continuing to close was the only plan they had left. She had 3 rounds. She had a limited window of drone exposure. She had a position that no longer had line of sight to the target area. She needed 30 seconds of exposure to re-establish. She waited for the drone's arc to take it east again. Counted. Moved. A round hit the ridge face where she'd been lying 2 seconds before. Close. Very close. Not luck, not on their part, and not on hers. They'd adjusted their pattern. Someone down there was still thinking. She was in her new position. The scope found the floor of Kilo 7 Foxtrot. She saw Marcus Holt on the ground. He'd taken a second hit to his already wounded leg. He was still moving, pushing himself into better cover, but his movements had the slow, thick quality of a man who was spending his last reserves. She saw Calloway with his back to the helicopter wreckage, running low on ammunition. She could tell by the deliberateness of his shots. Not suppression fire, not covering fire. Each round was a decision. He was spending them only when the math was certain. She saw Saunders trying to rebuild a radio signal with 1 good arm and 1 burned one, his face absolutely blank with concentration, doing a thing that required precision while a firefight happened around him. She had 3 rounds. The approaching fire team to the east was now 60 meters from Wraith Delta's position. At 60 meters, a grenade ends the discussion. Calloway had stopped counting the incoming rounds because counting had stopped being useful information. He knew the math. He'd always been good at math. It was one of the qualities that had made him effective in this specific kind of work, the ability to hold multiple calculations simultaneously and update them in real time. He knew how many rounds he had left. He knew how many hostiles were still closing. He knew the distance and the time. The math said they had between 90 seconds and 3 minutes, depending on how brave the approaching element was and whether they used grenades early or saved them for the final push. He'd made the radio call. He wasn't sure it had gone anywhere. Saunders had looked up from his work at one point and met his eyes and given him the expression that said, "I'm doing everything I can with what I have." It was enough. It had to be enough. "How are you doing?" he said to Holt, who was on the ground to his left. "Been worse," Holt said, which was a lie, but it was the right kind of lie. "Yeah," Calloway said. "Me too." He put another round downrange. Watched the effect. Adjusted. 45 meters now. The hostile element was moving in short rushes. 1 man up and running while the others provided covering fire. Then down. Then another man up. It was disciplined, and it was effective, and under any other circumstances he would have acknowledged it professionally. Right now it was simply the mechanism by which he was going to die in the next 90 seconds. "We won't make it," he said into the radio. Not panicked, not theatrical. Just a status report, accurate and final, transmitted into a frequency that might or might not be reaching anyone. Saunders heard it. He kept working. Holt heard it. He shifted his position so that he had a better angle on the approaching fire team, which cost him pain that showed on his face but nowhere else. Calloway found his last full magazine, seated it, and made the decision about how to spend what was in it. 30 meters. A grenade would reach them from 30 meters. He watched the closest hostile begin to rise for the next rush. And then he heard a sound that was not part of the pattern. A sharp, flat crack from somewhere high and distant, followed immediately before the echo could reach him by the collapse of the man who had just stood up. The fire team stopped. Another crack. A second man down. The fire team went to ground. A third crack. Something in the middle of the approaching formation detonated. She'd hit the RPG. They'd been carrying a RPG round at that distance. In that heat and the secondary explosion, threw 2 men clear of their position and put the remaining 3 into a confusion that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the simple animal response to fire appearing from an impossible location. 3 shots. 3 effects. Calloway pressed himself against the wreckage and did not shoot because there was nothing left to shoot at. The fire team was broken. The elevated positions were already neutralized. The radio was dead. The desert went quiet in the way that it had been quiet before the ambush began. Absolute, indifferent, without any particular feeling about what had just happened within it. He looked at Holt. Holt was staring at the sky. He looked at Saunders. Saunders had his eyes closed, one hand still resting on the radio equipment, his face showing something that Calloway would later describe as the expression of a man who had prepared for one ending and found himself in a different one. "Who?" Holt said. Calloway shook his head. I don't know. The third shot was the hardest. Not technically though, technically it was extraordinary, the RPG round being a smaller target than a human being, and one that required accounting for the particular metallic composition of the warhead casing, and how that affected the terminal effect of a high-velocity round against it at this range and in these conditions. Not technically the hardest, but technically close to the edge of what the rifle could do and what physics permitted. The hardest part was making the decision to take it. She had 2 rounds remaining when she found the RPG carrier. The man with the launcher was on the ground, 50 meters back from the fire team's lead element, waiting for the team to clear the last open ground before using the weapon at a range where it could not miss. He was patient. He was good at his job. He had done this before. She needed 1 round for him. That left 1 round, and she didn't yet know what would require the last round. Spending it on the RPG carrier meant betting that nothing else would arise in the remaining time before exfil reached Wraith Delta. She looked at the man with the launcher and ran the calculation. If she didn't take this shot, the fire team would close to throwing distance in the next 40 seconds. 1 grenade would kill all 3 SEALs. There was no cover left in their position that would stop a grenade at point-blank range. The RPG would do the same from 50 meters, and the man carrying it was not going to stop. She took the shot. She aimed not at the man but at the warhead in the launcher tube, angled to maximize the probability of secondary detonation. The shot had to be precise in a way that precision usually isn't, not approximately right, not statistically likely to hit, but specifically correct. The round traveled 3.1 kilometers. 2 of the approaching fire team's lead elements were between her and the target. The round passed between them not because she aimed between them, but because they happened to be positioned in a corridor that her established line of fire already threaded. A fact she noted without particular feeling because it was information, not providence. The secondary detonation from the RPG round killed the carrier and put the 2 nearest men on the ground. The rest of the fire team broke. She watched them go. She found the last remaining coherent hostile element through the scope, 3 men consolidating on the far side of the wadi, 300 meters from Wraith Delta. They were done fighting. She could see it in their body language, in the way they were oriented outward rather than inward, away from the contact rather than toward it. They were leaving. She let them go. 1 round remaining. No target justified it. The rules of her work were exact about when and when not to take a shot, and the precise line between those 2 categories was drawn around necessity and threat, not anger and opportunity. She held her position. 2 minutes later, she heard the sound of rotor blades from the west. The Pave Hawk came in fast and low, using terrain masking to stay below the horizon of any remaining threat until the last 200 meters of the approach. The door gunner was on his weapon. The flight medic was already on the floor of the cabin with his kit laid out. Calloway got Holt to his feet. Saunders moved under his own power, slowly. They crossed 40 meters of open desert to the helicopter's landing zone. 40 meters that felt, Calloway would later say, like either 400 or 4. He couldn't tell which. They got aboard. The medic went to work on Holt before the skids were clear of the ground. The crew chief looked at the 3 men, and then at the desert behind them, and then back at the men. "Anyone else?" he said. Calloway shook his head. "There was somebody out there. I don't know who. No one's waiting for extract? Nobody called for one." The crew chief looked at the desert again. It showed him nothing. The sand was still, the heat shimmer was still, the immense indifferent expanse of it was the same as it always was. He secured the door. Saunders, riding with his back against the helicopter's interior, looked out through the window as they lifted. The ridge where the shots had come from was a dark line against the pale sky. He watched it as the helicopter banked east. 3 kilometers, he said, to no one in particular. Holt, who had his eyes closed while the medic worked on him, said, "At least, in that heat." No spotter, no drone, 1 rifle. Holt didn't answer. Saunders watched the ridge until it disappeared behind the curvature of the terrain. Then he looked at his hands. They were still burned, still raw, still doing the faint tremor that hands do when they've been holding something too hard for too long. "Who was that?" he said. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Below, on the ridge, there were no prints left where she'd been lying. The wind had found them within minutes of her departure, a hot, directionless wind that moved across the desert's surface and erased whatever the heat had not already made temporary. She was already 2 kilometers east, moving back through the thermal shadow, her rifle across her back, her water supply nearly gone, her forearms a uniform raw pink from the ground contact. She had not called for extract because she had not finished her route clearance, the systematic check of her withdrawal path that she always completed before considering herself done. It was not caution. It was professionalism, the same professionalism that had governed every other decision she'd made in the previous 90 minutes. When she was done, she would call. Until then, she walked. The desert continued to burn around her. She let it. They played it back in full at 18. The TOC had accumulated data from 3 sources. The partial satellite coverage that had been restored when the hostile drone finally ran out of battery life and dropped from the sky. The acoustic sensors that had been monitoring the area and which had logged every shot taken. And the drone's own onboard memory, recovered after it crashed, which had captured everything it had seen from overhead. Marsh sat at the front of the room and watched the composite display without speaking. The technical debrief was led by an intelligence analyst named Sean Garrett, 29, meticulous, the kind of young professional who could read a battlefield from sensor data the way a doctor reads an X-ray. He walked through the sequence, shot by shot, using the acoustic timestamps to establish position and the satellite imagery to correlate effects. The room listened. Shot 1. The enemy commander, at grid reference 7 meters from the Helicopter wreckage, eliminated at 15 hours 22 minutes and 47 seconds. Range to confirmed firing position, 3,209 meters. Shot 2. Primary radio operator, eliminated. Range, same. Shot 3. Secondary radio antenna, disabled, same range. Shot 4. Eastern sniper position, neutralized. Range, 3,198 meters. Shot 5. Western sniper position, neutralized. Range, 3,201 meters. Shot 6. Lead element of fire team, eliminated. Range, 3,190 meters. Shot 7. RPG carrier, secondary detonation triggered. Range, 3,187 meters. A pause. Garrett looked up from his display. 7 shots. 7 effects. Time elapsed from first shot to last, 19 minutes and 41 seconds. During that period, the shooter changed position at minimum twice, confirmed by acoustic triangulation, while under active search by a hostile drone and suppressing fire from the surviving ground element. He paused again. The terminal effect of shot 7 caused secondary detonation of a live RPG round at 3.2 kilometers. I want to be transparent with this room about what that required technically. It is, to my knowledge, not documented as having been accomplished before at operational range. The room was quiet. Garrett closed his display. 1 shooter, no spotter, no drone support, 47-degree ambient temperature, 7 shots, 0 misses. He stepped back. That's the record. Kepler was sitting in the back of the room. He had been sitting there since the playback began, very still, in the manner of a man who has been confronted with information that requires him to rearrange a significant number of things he thought he understood. He did not say anything. Marsh stood up. He looked at Whitfield, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his face neutral in the particular British way that contains a great deal and expresses precisely nothing. "Where is she?" Marsh asked. "On base," Whitfield said. "She came in 20 minutes ago. She's in debrief, with her own chain of command. I'd like to speak with her. I'll pass that along." Marsh nodded. He looked at the composite display one more time at the grid references, the acoustic timestamps, the cold geometry of it, and then he looked at the room. He didn't make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He just said, "Dismissed," and let the silence fill in the rest. In a small room on the eastern side of the base, a woman with burned forearms and a rifle that she had just finished cleaning for the second time that day sat across from her squadron commander and answered questions in the direct, minimal way that she answered all questions. She did not describe the heat. She did not describe the difficulty. She did not describe what it had felt like to watch 7 targets fall over a distance of 3 kilometers in 19 minutes. She described wind conditions, equipment performance, position changes, and the behavioral pattern of the hostile drone. She described the decision to engage the RPG carrier and the reasoning behind it. She answered the technical questions precisely and the interpretive questions briefly. When the debrief was over, her commander, a man who had known her for 6 years and had written her evaluation reports with the careful language of someone who was trying to describe something extraordinary in a format designed for ordinary things, looked at her for a moment. "3 men came home today," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "Because of what you did. Because of what everyone did," she said. "They held their position. The pilot got the exfil there in time. Signals got the burst through in 9 seconds. Everyone did their part." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and released her. She picked up her rifle and walked out into the evening air, which had cooled to somewhere in the low 40s, almost pleasant, by the standards of the day. The sky above the desert was doing the thing desert skies do at dusk, moving through colors that have no names in normal use, reds and oranges and a deep amber that settled into violet at the edges. She walked across the compound to her quarters. In the TOC, Kepler stood up. He walked to where Whitfield was gathering his materials and stood there for a moment. Whitfield didn't look up. "Captain," Kepler said. Whitfield looked up. Kepler started to say something. Then he stopped. Then he tried again. "She didn't last a minute," he said finally. "Out there." He paused. "She lasted 19 minutes and 41 seconds and she didn't miss." Whitfield waited. "I was wrong," Kepler said. He said it simply, the way a man says something he has decided to say and is not going to qualify. Whitfield nodded. "Yes," he said. "You were." He picked up his materials and walked out. 3 hours later, in the medical bay, Raymond Calloway was lying on a cot with 2 cracked ribs taped and a dislocated shoulder back in its socket, a procedure that had required 3 people and produced sounds he would prefer not to have made in front of witnesses. He was looking at the ceiling when Marcus Holt was wheeled past in the direction of the surgical bay. Holt had his eyes open. He saw Calloway and raised one hand, just a small raise, just the fingers, and Calloway raised his hand back. Then Saunders appeared in the doorway. His arms were bandaged to the elbow. He came in and sat on the edge of a cot across from Calloway and looked at his hands for a while. "Do you know who it was?" Calloway said. "No," Saunders said. "They won't tell me. Whitfield says it's classification. The file, the whole thing." Calloway was quiet. "7 shots," he said. "I counted 5. But I was pretty occupied." "7. I got the debrief summary." Saunders looked up. 7. In 19 minutes. From 3.2 kilometers. Cold bore on the first one. Saunders exhaled. It was the sound a man makes when math becomes real rather than theoretical. "She didn't last a minute," Calloway said, quietly. He was almost smiling. "That's what somebody said. Before the mission. One of the American officers. She won't last a minute." Saunders thought about it. "She lasted long enough to end all of it." "Yeah." The medical bay was quiet. Outside, the desert was cooling under a sky full of stars, the vast, indifferent, beautiful desert that had tried to kill all of them today and had failed. Calloway looked at the ceiling. Somewhere on this base, the woman who had kept them alive was sleeping or cleaning her rifle or doing whatever she did after a mission. She wasn't receiving a citation tonight. She wasn't giving a statement to anyone with a camera. Her name would not appear in the briefing that got circulated tomorrow morning. Just a call sign in a log file. Mirage 1. Engaged. Exfil complete. Return to base. And out there in the desert, the ridge where she had lain for those 19 minutes and 41 seconds was being slowly smoothed by the wind, each press of air erasing a fraction more of whatever evidence had existed, until the sand was again clean and flat and unmarked. As if no one had been there, as if it had all been a mirage. She had lasted 19 minutes and 41 seconds. She had not missed once. She had walked back into the dark, and that, in the end, was the whole story, except for the part that couldn't be told, which was the part where 3 men lay in the dark of the medical bay and felt the particular weight of being alive when the math had said otherwise, and thought about a woman they would probably never meet, and said nothing, because some things are too large for the words that are available. The desert kept its silence, the stars kept their distance, and somewhere between the two, a soldier who had done an extraordinary thing slept the uncomplicated sleep of a person who had done what was needed and asked nothing for it. The wind moved across the sand. The prints were gone. The desert remembered nothing. It never does. That is perhaps the one mercy it offers, not to the living or to the dead, but to the work itself, to the thing that was done and cannot be undone and does not need a monument, because the people who came home are monument enough. Mirage 1. The name would not appear in any citation. It would not be spoken at any ceremony. It would live in log files and acoustic sensor reports, and the quiet, factual debriefs of men who had been there and chosen their words with great care, not to hide what happened, but because they understood that some things described themselves better in numbers than in language. 7 shots, 0 misses, 19 minutes and 41 seconds. 3 men alive who had calculated themselves dead. The wind moved across the sand. The prints were gone.